Thank you all for coming out of the cold into the warm embrace of the Washington Institute. We're very fortunate today to really talk about a very timely subject. It's been a lot in the news about the visit of Prime Minister Netanyahu to the U.S. Congress and all the controversy that has ensued. It has raised also a question about the U.S. Israel relationship in general. How is that landscape changing? How is it changing in Israel? How is it changing in the United States? And we're really fortunate to have two people who I think have really thought a lot about this issue and have actually both written books with Cambridge University Press. Now, you may have already read Elliott Abrams' book, Tested by Zion, and this one is just hot off the press. As a matter of fact, our author just saw it for the first time yesterday, so it's really hot off the press. So, John Rynhold is a senior researcher at the Begin and Sadat Center for Strategic Studies at Bar-Ilan University. He's director of the Argov Center for the Study of Israel and the Jewish People. And this latest book, Arab-Israel Conflict in the American Political Culture, by Cambridge, is really an effort to try to say, how is that landscape changing in the United States? So I know in Washington people read these books by going to the index first, but I think you should also read the book itself. I think it's a fascinating look at the changing landscape here in the United States. And we're also very fortunate to have Elliott Abrams, who's not a stranger to many people here, a senior fellow at the Middle East Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations. Previously, he was the Deputy National Security Advisor in the George W. Bush administration, focusing on the Middle East. He publishes widely, not just on U.S. Israel relations, really, but on U.S. Middle East policy writ large. Many of you have read his book of his accounts of the time in the Bush administration. I would urge you to read it if you have not. Tested by Zion. It's also a fascinating look at the 8 years of the Bush administration, how they dealt with the Arab-Israeli question or the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So I think we've got two people here who really have thought a lot about this issue, and I'm just really fortunate that they're both here. And Johnny, I want to call on you to start us off.
I'd like to thank you and the Institute for inviting me to speak to you here today. If anyone has any problems with my Israeli accent, just let me know. Okay, so I'm here to talk a little bit about my book, which looks at America, but I've been asked, since I'm coming from Israel, to also give you some sort of sense about how Israel and Israelis and the political divides in Israel, how it all looks out when it looks towards the United States. And at the Begin Sadat Center, we did recently some polling of Israelis about how they look at the U.S. relationship. So I'm going to start by looking at that before I pivot over to the American side of the equation. Now, if we were to look at the elite level at Israeli governments, we would say that in the 1990s, when Netanyahu was prime minister and Clinton was president, it was clear that the Likud-led government tried to work with Republicans in Congress to help block policies that they didn't like from the Democrat-led Clinton administration. And we see this happening again now. And in the interim, we had a Barak-led government of the left in Israel, which tried to coordinate and work extremely closely with the Clinton administration. So we did have some kind of a partisan issue going around. But on the other hand, if we look at the Iran issue in Israel, we see that there's a consensus on the threat from Iran. The divide in Israel was not party-like and not about what you thought about Palestinian state. It was about how assertive Israel should be. And you had Ehud Barak and Netanyahu on the same side of the equation, saying Israel should be assertive, and the Israeli defense establishment saying we need to take more account of the United States. And with that, I'd just like to say all of that happened below the radar of the Israeli public. The Israeli public was not engaged on any of those issues. Only recently, really, with this latest crisis, if you like, over the congressional speech, has the Israeli public begun to get engaged in this issue in a more serious way. And if we look at how the Israeli public thinks about the US, we see that it's every Israeli, and this is Jews and Arabs, this is not just Jewish Israelis, it's thinks that close relations with the United States is very important or even vital to Israel. In fact, for Israelis, the relationship with the US is second only to Israel's military power. In other words, it's more important than peace, and it's more important than the settlements. It cuts right across the left-right divide. It's completely consensual. And just to give you some idea of how consensual it is, those people who define themselves as on the right in Israel, they also think that the relationship with the US is more important than the settlements. In other words, it really is consensual. Despite everything that's happened and all the crises between the government of Israel and the Obama administration, almost 3/4 of Israelis think America is a loyal ally. It's actually gone up. Very slightly, but it's gone up. In other words, when Israelis think of the United States, they think it's vitally important and completely reliable. Now, when it comes to President Obama, it's a different story. Okay? In the past, what we saw was a majority of Israelis thought he had a positive approach towards Israel. In the beginning, there were lots of undecideds. But in November this year, Israelis were evenly divided, positive, negative, on Obama's approach to Israel itself. Okay? The interesting thing is that does divide up by, if you're right or center-right, you tend to think he's got a negative approach. If you're center-left or center or left, you tend to think he is a more positive approach. But that's not what really counts. It's not about for Israelis what Obama thinks of Israel. It's about his policies to the Middle East. And here again, consensual approach, saying they're bad. Okay? By very large margins, Israelis tend to think that President Obama's policies towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, towards Iran, and towards ISIS are bad. ISIS is slightly better because the Obama administration's been more willing to be assertive in that area, and Israelis tend to think the United States should be assertive. Now, if you ask me, on a deeper level, what is one thing that Israelis misunderstand about the relationship with the US, that is the public, is that they don't understand how important to Americans the idea of shared democratic values is. In other words, Israelis think the strategic relationship is very important. They think the political power of American Jewry is very important. 5% think that shared democratic values is important. And I think that when we pivot over to the American side of the equation, and particularly inside the Democratic Party, though not exclusively, the importance of Israel as a democracy is underappreciated by Israelis, and it leads to misjudgments about the relationship. Okay, this is my book, The Arab-Israeli Conflict in American Political Culture. I chose that picture because I think it sums up what makes the U.S.-Israel relationship different from Israel's relationships with other countries, and that is Americans don't just sympathize with Israel, they identify with Israel. And when you come from a country where that isn't the case, and a continent where that isn't the case, you really notice the difference. This is my core thesis of the books. A paradox has emerged in the way Americans relate to Israel. On the one hand, Americans identify with Israel, and sympathy for Israel is widespread and has surged to new heights in the 21st century. Americans have never been more supportive of Israel in public opinion polls. Never. On the other hand, Americans are increasingly divided about the Arab-Israeli conflict, and this division increasingly aligns with the major political, that's parties, ideological, liberal, conservative, and religious divides in America. Mainline Christians, mainline Protestants, evangelicals, Orthodox Jews, non-Orthodox Jews. And what is more, these divisions are mutually reinforcing, part of a wider process of polarization in America. In other words, Americans as a whole are more sympathetic, but when it comes to policy, they're more divided, and that divide is increasingly solidifying into two polarized camps. Here's the sympathies. Okay, so you can see that basically since more or less 9/11, okay, for the first time in Gallup polls, an absolute majority of Americans sympathize with Israel, and the numbers for the Palestinians, okay, remain low. They remain low. If we compare that with Europe, we see that America's sympathy has gone up. There's a huge gap. between the largest countries in Europe. Yeah, whether we take sympathy with the Palestinians, I've taken the margin. In other words, not just how sympathetic they are to Israel, but how sympathetic they are to the Palestinians, and look at the gap between. And the numbers for the US have not changed. If you look today, Gallup polls have come out. The gap is almost identical. It might be a percentage point higher or lower. And favourable opinion is now 70. It's not 68. It's gone up. And believe you me, it has not gone up in Europe. Okay, so the gap is there. In other words, when it comes to sympathy, the basic fact of the matter is, for historical reasons and cultural reasons, Americans identify with Israel. It's to do with the Protestant foundations of America. Yeah, even a third of American Catholics think that because it says in the Bible that God promised the land of Israel to the Jews, that has political and religious significance today. The Pope does not believe this. It's not a Catholic doctrine. It's American Catholics because they read it like Protestants, because America is very influenced by Protestantism. The other thing is that Americans identify historically with Israel as a democracy, even if they're critical of its policies. And that's different from Europeans, for whom democracy is a system. It's not part of their identity. The question is, why has it gone up in America? Okay, why has it gone up? Okay, the fundamental identification, which I can go into later, is to do with identity. It's to do with the American creed. It's to do with religion and Protestantism. But it's gone up. And the reason it's mainly gone up is 9/11. And that is, Americans increasingly see Israel as a front line in a broader struggle against terrorism, radical Islam, extremism, take your pick. That only the English-speaking countries, Australia, Canada, and the UK, consistently rank higher as US allies these days. That was not true before 9/11. Israel was in the second tier, below Japan and Germany, not just below these countries. Israel's gone up as it's important as an ally. 75% of Americans think helping to protect Israel should be one of the top 5 goals of American policy in the Middle East. Okay? It's important. Europeans come from a different place. They don't have that identification. They have a different strategic culture. They don't see the Middle East. They don't see the use of force in the same way as Americans, and we can go back over that. So that gap has only got wider. So sympathy is solid. That's what I'm trying to say to you. Americans are different. They remain different from Europeans. When it comes to identity and sympathy, it's clear. What's changed is the way different groups in American society and politics relate to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, I don't have time to go into American Jews or American Protestants, which I can do in Q&A. So I'm just going to focus on partisanship, parties and ideologies. And what we see here is a growing partisan divide, okay? If it was just sympathy, yeah? I mean, look at the Republicans. Huge jump, right? Huge jump. And this is the gap between sympathy for Israel and sympathy for the Palestinians. It's not just one. It's the gap between them. That's what really counts. Huge jump. Now, it's not that the Democrats, yeah, are not sympathetic. They have gone down a bit in the last year. Okay, but it's not clear yet whether that's a trend or it's a blip. But generally, the Democrats have hung around on the same sort of space in sympathy when you add it all up together. But the gap between the parties has grown. Now, if it was just sympathy, it's not relevant. So someone loves you and someone loves you more. Okay, doesn't matter. Okay, but the thing is that there is a divide, not just a gap, a policy divide when it comes to dealing with the Arab-Israeli conflict across all the issues. So Republicans are equivocal about a Palestinian state. When President Bush makes a speech in favor, there's a narrow majority in favor. Afterwards, there's a narrow majority against. Democrats are increasingly clear that they support a Palestinian state. Okay, it's more than doubled in the first decade of the new millennium. Okay, and that's a huge gap between the parties on a key issue. Who's making an effort to make peace? So on Israel, both sides say Israel's making an effort. There's a big gap. Republicans think more, but Democrats also think that. The real divide here is about Palestinians. Huge gap. The Republicans think the Palestinians aren't serious about peace. A small majority of Democrats think the Palestinian Authority, Abbas, is. Now that means the Democrats are more divided than the Republicans. The Republicans have one clear, large majority view. Okay, the Democrats are divided, but the balance within the Democrats is in a different place. Should the US get tough with Israel over settlements? Republicans say no, Democrats say yes. What should US do in the Gaza war in 2009? Republicans say publicly support Israel. Democrats say even-handed. Now, Democrats are reasonably divided, right? The Republicans are all much more clearly one direction. If Israel attacks Iran to stop its nuclear weapons, what should the US do? Republicans support Israel. Democrats stay neutral. This is just from the most recent war, and it's the most pronounced. American views of Israeli actions in the current Middle East conflict. This was from July 2014. Republicans say Israel's justified, a plurality of Democrats say unjustified, which is a change from the 2009 and 2012 conflicts where Democrats were more or less evenly divided. And the interesting thing is this maps the elite dialogue, the elite discourse. So when I didn't just do polling, I went and looked. I read The Atlantic, I read The New Republic, I read The American Conservative, I read the op-eds of the New York Times and the Washington Post over a 20-year period and looked at the trends. And Republicans basically see the Middle East, see Israel as part of a wider struggle with common enemies, radical Islam, common values and common enemies. They see the Palestinians as overwhelmingly to blame for the peace process. They're skeptical about the value of the peace process. They think America should have an assertive policy. There's a minority who don't think that, but the majority in the discourse and the majority in the public opinion is that way. At the very top of elite decision makers, it's a little bit different. But in terms of big groups of people in discourse, that's the way it is. Democrats are united, and liberals by two states and opposition to settlements. But they're divided about who's to blame for the lack of peace. They're divided about whether America should have an assertive foreign policy. They're divided about where the onus should be put, Israel or the Palestinians. And on all those questions, they lean towards the onus should be on Israel. They lean towards being more dovish. They lean towards pushing the peace process and more pressure on both sides or primarily on Israel. And what's most interesting is it's generational. In other words, if we look, who among Democrats and liberals thinks that, okay, we all agree, in inverted commas, settlements are bad and the two-state solution is good. But if we take Jeffrey Goldberg or Tom Friedman, they think, wait, but Hezbollah and Hamas, that's a real problem. On that, we need to be with Israel. These ideas matter. Ideas, identities, they matter. It's not all material interests. And America needs to be assertive, and Israel needs to be assertive on these issues. On other things, it's different, but on that. If we look at the younger commentators who blog or who write opinion pieces or who serve in the Obama administration, younger people, they agree with the older lot about two states, and they agree about Palestine and about opposition settlements, but they're far more critical of Israeli security policy in dealing with Hamas and Hezbollah, and they're far less understanding of Israel's security requirements in any kind of deal with the Palestinians. They think it's a much safer world, and they see Israel as more responsible. So that there is a division in the Democrats, but the younger ones have more of a problem with Israeli policy than the older ones. But just to be 100% clear, even the least pro-Israel demographic in the US, which is liberals, are more pro-Israel than the most pro-Israel demographic in Europe, which is the right. Okay, so just so that we get we come back to reality, it's still America, right? America is different. In America, as I explained in a recent conference, when I say I'm from Israel, people go, oh. When I say I'm from Israel in England, they go, oh. Right? That hasn't changed. That's not going to change. It's policy. The question is, what's behind this? Why is this happening? And here it's to do with a number of things. First and foremost, the ideological polarization of the American political system. The Republicans are a conservative party, and they have become more of a conservative party. The Democrats are a supermarket of different ideologies, but whereas moderate, a decade, 10, 15 years ago, moderates were the dominant force, and if we see conservatives and liberals were about the same size. Now look at it. Liberals are the largest group, and it hasn't changed since 2011. It's actually more pronounced. And moderates are the second largest, and conservatives aren't there, right? They're well out of it. So the least pro-Israel demographic, the demographic that's most prone to be critical of Israeli security policies, is now the largest. And this is a generational thing. This is from Pew, not Gallup. And it tracks in each generation conservatism and liberalism. This is the first generation, the millennial generation, in which there are more liberals than conservatives in America. In other words, right now there are double the amount of self-identifying conservatives in America than liberals. But that is going to erode if things continue as they have done since the end of the Second World War. So the first thing that's happening is demographic change within the parties and within America at large. And that is causing the division. The second thing is that this, and so if you look at my first graphic, you'll see that the attitudes of ideology and party are almost identical on the Arab-Israeli conflict. And the ideological gap and the partisan gap are almost the same. But why on Israel? Why is Israel such a hot button issue? Well, part of it is because Israel is so important to American identity, so everyone gets flustered about it. Okay, that I'm not going to go into. The other thing is that Americans, the political parties, are most divided on foreign policy and on ideology. And where has American foreign policy debates been focused on since 9/11? On the Middle East, where Israel is. So Israel is part of a broader polarization, ideological and on foreign policy. Americans, Democrats and Republicans, used to agree in peace through strength as opposed to diplomacy first, right? The gap was pretty narrow in 1997. And it was a gap. Both were over 50% agreeing. Now it's a divide, right? Republicans have become more hawkish and Democrats have become more dovish. And so that informs how they look at policy towards Israel. Not how they feel about Israel, but how they think about what Israel should do and what the U.S. should do vis-a-vis Israel and the conflict. And the other thing that's important goes to ideas, ideology, values, those kind of things. Democrats tend to think those are less important. Republicans tend to think they're more important. So when you ask the question, does Islam encourage violence more than other religions? Okay? It's grown in both parties, the amount of people who answer yes to that. But it's doubled among Republicans and it's sneaked up among Democrats. So those two big issues in thinking about the Middle East and thinking about foreign policy inform Israel. People don't think about Israel all day long in the United States. They think about where's the threat coming from to the United States? What should the US do about it? And they slot Israel into that. With a warm place, because they've all got sympathy, but they slot it in different ways. And this is what lies behind it. Okay, now I don't have time to go into what Protestants and American Jews think and how it lines up. I'm happy to do it in Q&A. I've got the graphs ready for you if you want them. What I would like to just say to finish off is, what does all this mean? What does it all mean politically for the relationship? So I think the first thing is that which is more important politically, increased sympathy or increased division? And I think politically increased division is more important, because if most of the sympathy increase, not all of it, is on one side of the equation, then your problem is that, well, generally in democracies, one party doesn't always win every election. So you're better off with a lower level of sympathy that's more evenly spread and is more the same on policy issues. The question is, what do we do about it? Well, I think there are two things. If I think of this as a Venn diagram and I want a good U.S. Israel relationship, I want to focus on that part of the Venn diagram where everyone agrees, that interlocks. And I think there are two issues here where the Israeli public and the American public agree, things that aren't divided and aren't partisan. The first is the security of Israel. What's striking to a British-born Israeli is how Americans, when they reel off the American interest in the Middle East, mention the security of Israel. And we've seen that that's really up there for Americans, right, as a goal. That is not something that can be taken for granted. It's not something that any other country says. Clearly for Israel, Israel's security is the number one thing. Now, obviously, people have different views about what that means, but if you start with that as your base, the onus is to show that you are demonstrating that you are actually protecting Israeli security, which is seen as related in a sense to American security. So I think focusing on that is very important, and it's something that can build consensus. And the other is a two-state solution and settlements. In other words, it's very significant to me that even Israeli rightists think, that the support of the United States is more important than the settlements. In other words, you have potentially a foundation in Israel for a consensus on this. This is an increasingly important issue for Democrats and liberals. And therefore, if Israel wishes to maintain that Venn diagram of bipartisan support for the state of Israel in a meaningful sense, not just sympathy, but support for policies when it sometimes gets tough, it needs to do its bit to situate its policies inside the Venn diagram of supporting a two-state solution, being credible about it, and being circumspect about settlements. None of what I'm saying today means that the tensions that I'm talking about means that the special relationship between Israel and the US, and it really is special, is in any kind of immediate danger. I think of this as political ecology. It's the ozone layer of the special relationship. You don't want to damage the bipartisanship, and we all know what's going on right now. And what I see from what's going on right now is we can see the temptation for what the Israeli government is doing, right? We can see why they would think like that. But if we take a step back and we don't think just about what's going to happen tomorrow, but we think about the welfare of the relationship over the long term, then I think we have to, from an Israeli perspective, have a more circumspect policy that makes sure that the bipartisan support for Israeli security that exists in the United States continues to be the case. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I urge everybody to read Jonathan's book, which is very rich. And he only touched, the top sort of 5% of it. There are a few points I thought I would make, questions to raise about the book and about the arguments in it. First, I am struck by one fact, which is that for 15 years, Israel has had right-wing governments. And I wonder if some of the phenomena that we observe in the United States among Democrats and in Europe more generally is at least in part the product of that fact. Would we be looking at this diminution in support for Israel had Israel had left-wing governments for 15 years? Suppose that the Herzog coalition wins the election on March 17th, and Israel has a left-of-center government. Would that not put a significant dent in the declining numbers, or rather, would it not kick up a little bit the declining numbers that we see on the left in the U.S. and in Europe? Now, maybe, of course, on the right, people would be angry with that government. Orthodox Jews, potentially, but others in the Jewish community here and others in government in Europe and in the U.S. would be happier. And I think tension between the Obama administration and the government of Israel would decline. This is an interesting test of liberal American Jews who are, in a sense, as Jonathan says in the book, forced by the current situation, left-wing government in the U.S., right-wing government in Israel, to choose, in a sense, which affiliation matters more to them. My affiliation as a liberal Democrat American Jew, or my affiliation as a Jew with supporting Israel. And judging from the numbers, the affiliation with the left has been stronger. But that could change overnight on March 17th. Very interesting point that Jonathan makes about Israel being a litmus test for the U.S. public of presidential credibility on American security. He makes the point that for a lot of Americans, if you're not supportive of Israel and Israeli security, that suggests that you don't get the security problem we in the United States face. That is, you don't get the problem of for one thing, Islamist extremism. And that reminded me of an interesting Walter Russell Mead column from 4 years ago, a blog item actually, in which I'll just read you a paragraph. The idea of Jewish and Israeli exceptionalism is profoundly tied to the idea of American exceptionalism. The belief that God favors and protects Israel is connected to the idea that God favors and protects America. The existence of Israel means that the God of the Bible is still watching out for the well-being of the human race. For many American Christians who are nothing like fundamentalists, the restoration of the Jews to the Holy Land and their creation of a successful democratic state after 2,000 years of oppression and exile is a clear sign that the religion of the Bible can be trusted. Being pro-Israel matters in American mass politics because the public mind believes at a deep level that to be pro-Israel is to be pro-American and pro-faith. Substantial numbers of voters who believe that politicians who don't get Israel don't get America and don't get God. Interesting comment by Walter Russell Mead that I think is borne out by some of the numbers. I am struck by what I would call the Palestinianization of American-Israeli relations. What do I mean by that? If you ask people in the Gulf, Saudis, Emiratis, if you ask Egyptians today, their relationship with Israel does not turn exclusively or even primarily on Palestinians. There are a lot of other issues now. There's the Islamic State. There's Iran, Iranian troops in Syria, Hezbollah as an Iranian force, Iran now in Yemen. So for them, there are a lot of Israel issues, one of which is Palestinians. But it's interesting that for Americans, according to Jonathan's numbers, Americans left of center, it's not true. The critical issue is still Palestinians, Palestinian state, settlements. So, Jonathan asked the question at the end, what do we do? Well, if you're trying to increase support for Israel in Europe and on the American center-left, de-Palestinianize the American-Israeli relationship. Now, that may require a new administration because it was, let me say, the focus on settlements was really an early move on the part of the Obama administration. You may recall it was the second day of the administration that George Mitchell was appointed as a special negotiator, and he put this emphasis on settlements. But I think that's a way forward. Israel is trapped in this left-right contest, to some extent in the United States and in Europe. It would be better, obviously, for the Israelis if everything connected with Israel didn't rise and fall with the occupation, the settlements. And I again, easier to say than to do as an Israeli foreign policy, but I think it would greatly help Israel. Conversely, Israel faces a problem, and Jonathan gets at this in the book. It's one thing for Israelis to say, and Israeli governments to say, what they have more or less been able to say for the last few decades. We want peace. We want peace, but it's not possible. The Palestinians keep saying no. Well, first there's Arafat, and we can't give him a state. And Arafat says no to Barak at Camp David, and Abbas says no to Olmert after Annapolis. That's, in a sense, an argument that people left, right, and center understand about Israel. Harder to sell would be the argument that it's hopeless, there's no point in negotiating, there is no partner, because what people hear, particularly on the left, when that is said, what they hear is the occupation is permanent. And they don't want to hear that, and they don't like that. So, again, from the sort of Hasbara point of view, from the point of view of how does Israel improve those numbers in Europe and on the left of center in the U.S., I think that's one critical point. It isn't that people expect peace tomorrow. It is, I think, that they expect Israel to be trying to make peace. I guess one more point I'd like to make. Jonathan talks in the book about peoplehood, and I think that's a very important concept when it comes to Jewish support for Israel. The question is not simply a left-right question. It is that, but it's more than that. It's a question of whether foreign Jews in the diaspora, feel this sense of common peoplehood with the Jews of Israel. I think it's fair to say that the American Jewish community is the least Zionist community in the world. If you compare Argentina, France, Australia, it's how do you judge these things? Well, one way, travel. What percentage of American Jews have been to Paris and what percentage have been to Jerusalem? Those numbers are changing because of birthright, which I think is a very important and I would argue successful program, because it's hard to maintain that sense of peoplehood absent a visit to Israel. The sense of it, of course, 100 years ago was simple because they were the same people. They had come from the same places, and some had gone to the U.S. or the Western Hemisphere and others to Israel. That obviously fades with generations. The impact of Israel's wars fades over time. The impact of the Holocaust fades over time, and we are reaching the point, really, I would have to say in the next few years, when there will be very few, if any, Holocaust survivors alive. A young Holocaust survivor is about 80 nowadays. So the next decade or so. So how do you sustain that sense of peoplehood? Because without it, what do you have? As the numbers show, you have an American Jewish community that is de-Judaizing in the majority. That is, very high intermarriage rate, very low connection to the community, again, measured however you want to measure it, membership in synagogues, attendance at synagogue, all of those numbers point to obviously a growth of the Orthodox community, but the marginalization of the rest of the American Jewish community. Will those people maintain the sense of peoplehood if they do not much practice Judaism? And if they are intermarried and not raising their children as Jews? I think that's a huge challenge for Israel. Birthright is an effort to deal with it by saying, well, go there, you'll see, it will matter. And again, I think it's a successful effort because it's directed at the right problem, which is, I think, a diminishing sense of connectivity on the part of at least substantial portions of the American Jewish community. Final point, I've gone on too long. Jonathan ends fairly pessimistically on the settlement issue. I would be a little bit more optimistic. I think the Bush administration basically had a decent deal with Israel. I think a Democratic administration can have a decent deal with Israel in which settlement construction takes place in the major blocks and not way beyond the security fence in the middle of what may someday be Palestine. What David and others have called the peace map does not change because instead of 38,000 people in Ma'ale Adumim, you have 40,000 people in Ma'ale Adumim. I think there's a formula out there that, pardon my partisanship, a more friendly administration in Washington could find. Anyway, again, it's a terrific book, so I urge you to delve into it. And by the way, I just want to correct one thing David said. When he said he urged people to read my book, read Jonathan's book, that's secondary. Buy it. That's the important thing.
Elliott, I'll take that as a friendly amendment, as we say in Washington. Mm-hmm. Both buy and read. Great. So I think we've had really two really fascinating presentations. I maybe start with you, Jonathan, and really, you talked about the sympathy issue versus the policy issue. And I think you alluded to it by saying, when you read the different magazines and different kind of leading blogs, but how do you see the gap between elite opinion and kind of more, just public opinion nationwide? And how do you, if you cared about this issue, which I know you do, how do you narrow that gap, that the elite opinion is more like it? Or is it the nature of elite opinion is that it's always going to be more policy focused, and the non-elite opinion is going to be, maybe some would say, less policy focused, more gut focused? I don't know if that's a fair thing. And I guess with Elliott, I guess there's other questions here, which is, I think that was an interesting observation about the last 15 years, about how that was, how things could have been different. Do you find that if you were to say now, if you were to go to, the Prime Minister of Israel and or the leaders of American Jewish groups, and you were saying how to maintain the bipartisanship on this issue. I know you said, well, look, if maybe under different circumstances, look how the Arab Israel kind of relates to each other. They kind of find common cause on Iran and ISIS and militants in their own country. Are there other things that could be done, in your view, to narrow the gap? I mean, on one hand, you say you're partisan, but I know you care about the bipartisanship on this issue. Do you agree with what Jonathan said about focusing, also educating Israelis, I don't know, on the democratic values piece of it, not just interest but values? Or how do you narrow that gap on the bipartisanship? If you were giving some friendly advice, maybe to the other side on this. Okay, John.
Thank you, David. The gap between elites and the public. I think one of the things that was really striking to me in my research was that there wasn't, on most things, much of a gap. In other words, elites and the public, discourse in magazines, ex-policy people writing op-eds and public opinion polls, they're pretty much of a piece, which was fascinating because I didn't expect that. There were 2 or 3 areas where it wasn't, and I'll focus on that. The first thing is that conservative elites, discourse in conservative magazines is far more moderate than public opinion when it comes to Palestinian state and settlements. In other words, when you read the National Review or commentary, it sounds a lot more centrist on those kind of issues, particularly before it became an electronic issue, and then there were many more articles. When it was less articles, it sounded a lot more centrist, actually. And that was interesting. And equally, on the other side, when you go to policy-making elites, you go up to policy-making elites, the minority on the Republican conservative side, which believes that the United States should take an even-handed approach, is more powerful than it has very little hold in American conservative public opinion, but it has a lot of people at the highest levels that come out of think tanks in Washington who have more of a say. And on the Democrat and the liberal side, the political elites are more centrist, again, on policy issues than the liberal discourse. The liberal discourse, there's a whole side of it which is, although it's a minority, is hostile to Israel, which has no political expression in Congress. It's not there. It's not there, and that's an interesting thing. But my concern is that what happens in the discourse and the academic discourse and the intellectual discourses, people who are interested in the Middle East and interested in politics, that's the world in which they grow up in. That is their baseline for the truth. And then when they go into policy, they're constrained by certain political realities in the Middle East and certain political realities in Washington of widespread support. But that's not the way they think about it. And when they get an opportunity about what they want to do and they want to act, then it makes a difference. And their instincts are different. And the way that they're colored, that we have a generation of people now in the White House who are colored by the Iraq War. And anyone who was in favor of the Iraq War is wrong on a whole series of issues. So if they were in favor of the Iraq War and they said support Israel, if you're against the Iraq War, then you have to be much more hard on Israel. And it's like a package deal. It's not based on great in-depth thing. It's to do with predispositions. How do you deal with it? I think there's a failure. I'd say my biggest concern is a failure on the liberal democratic side to understand the realities of Israel's situation in the Middle East. In other words, to me, it's less significant where you fall on a policy question. It's more significant about how you think about it. I think there's a failure to really know what's going on, what the real dilemmas are. There's a failure to think it through in terms of, well, let's say Israel does A, what then happens is B, and what knock-on effects they have. No, it's Israel's motivation is X, that's bad, therefore. I think there's a failure to think it through in not realpolitik terms, but in realpolitik terms. Yeah, the realities on the ground as opposed to sort of a Machiavellian approach. And I think bringing people to Israel and seeing the kind of and going to these places and saying, okay, so here's what it looks like. Here's what happens. Here's hearing from the Jordan, not just the Israelis, they're hearing from the Jordanians as well. What happens if Israel pulls out, doesn't have any forces along the Jordan River? What does that actually mean? What's likely to happen? Why are we the Jordanians against it? Right? I think hearing some of that reality it's similar to what Elliott said. It douses down some of the Israel-Palestine thing is too big. It's obviously big for Israelis and Palestinians, but if you're an American, it should be smaller. For us, it's going to be very important because it's right on our doorstep. It should be smaller because the Middle East really doesn't turn on what happens, just outside Jerusalem if a settlement built is a bit here or a bit there. So it matters less to me if you're for or against it. It matters more to me if you understand what it means. And I think the way things are looked at in American academia is a hard thing to change. Much easier is to take people to Israel and force them to engage with realities and have to answer difficult questions. And I think David Ignatius just had a column when he quoted Yuval Steinitz on the dangers of proliferation, dangers of a nuclear deal, and he's in favor of it. But he said, for those of us in favor, we need to answer these points. And that, for me, is what I would like to see more of. On the Israeli side, we make you have to answer the hard questions, not the easy ones.
You could, before we go to Elliott, just to follow up, because you also showed on the numbers that the younger ones, the college age and others, weren't as focused on the security context. Do you see that as a function of, they grew up, that there was always in Israel, the wars, the Holocaust has faded? Or do you see this as a generational phase that college students focus more on the kind of the moral grammar of the issue and less on the kind of the geopolitical context and all the security dangers and the like? In other words, is it a phase or is it a function of their own?
It's neither. It's not to do with being young and something that you grow out of, and it's not to do with Israel. It's to do with the fact that attitudes in America are becoming more liberal, and they're becoming more dovish on foreign policy in general, and it's a pattern which all developed countries have followed. And that it doesn't mean that American attitudes are converging with European attitudes. They're in parallel. America starts higher with the use of force, but the European center-left and the American center-left are going in the same direction like that. And then the Israel story and the I'm a young university radical story fit into that. But actually, it's a much, much wider thing. There's a political scientist called Rynhold Engelhardt who's been following political culture for 40 years in the West and globally. And this is a huge trend that you see. And that's why it's a much more difficult thing to get at. And I think that's why I'm saying to you, I think that they tend to assume that if you say Israeli security, it's a cover for the occupation. And what one needs to show is that for the welfare, the framing is, if you really believe in peace, then it needs to be good for both sides. Both sides have to do certain things. If we damage Israeli security, we damage the Palestinians' chance of a Palestinian state that's viable and will actually be good for them. Understanding the linkage that way, it's starting from a frame of not what's good for Israel, but what's good for both. And realizing that unless it's good for Israel, it won't be good for both, right? But that does cut both ways. That is the way into it, because actually, if you're going to be fair-minded, there's no other, it's very hard to answer otherwise. But if we make it, in the US, you've been able to do something that you haven't been able to do in Europe since the mid-1970s, which is to say it's mainly about Israel. Increasingly, you can't do that among Democrats. You have to say, is it good for peace? But if you say this is good for peace and you make that case, then I think you force people to answer the difficult questions that can't be sloganized, and I think that's good. I think it's good for everyone.
Great.
How do we narrow the gap? Well, judging from the numbers you've presented, the best thing you could do for Israel would be to raise the voting age to 30 in the United States, but we'll put that aside as impractical. Clearly, at a moment like this, there should be a particular outreach to Democrats Democrats in Congress, Democrats in the states. And one of the things that, perhaps this doesn't make sense from the point of view of Israeli politics, but, Israel's represented abroad by its foreign ministry and by its prime minister's office. And I do wonder if it might be possible for, we'll have to see what happens after the election, but in a sense to enlist what has been for 15 years the opposition, the left, the Labor Party, and others on the left, to undertake their own efforts to reach out to left-of-center parliamentarians in the United States and in other countries, particularly in Europe, obviously in coordination with the foreign ministry, but they might be able to have a special kind of outreach. I could make a good argument that all my friends on the right in Israel would probably not appreciate that if the prime minister, the evening of the election, has the choice between a right-wing government and a grand coalition, he would be better off from this point of view going for the grand coalition and including Labor, because it would address some of these issues. I was thinking of the argument that it would help a lot if Israel would do more to improve Palestinian life in the West Bank in particular. I can't really make that argument in good faith. I can make it as a moral argument. It's the right thing to do. But the Netanyahu government has done a lot of that, done more of it than the predecessor governments in terms of removing obstacles, checkpoints, and so forth, trying to improve the Palestinian economy. More can be done. But what credit has been given to Israel for what has been done? Zero. So it's hard to make the argument that that would actually work. I guess one final thing, if it's possible to clarify, and I realize that there are Israeli political reasons not to, but it's possible to clarify what Israeli settlement policy is. In fact, and David has done a lot of work on this, the vast bulk of the settlement construction is in the major blocks. It's not beyond the fence. It's in areas that under any peace plan that anybody's ever seen will be part of Israel and that don't change that famous peace map. That doesn't come across. There is a sense that, and you see it in the loose talk of a lot of European and even American politicians about new settlements and about settlement expansion that clearly gives a sense of the gobbling up of more and more and more of what might someday be Palestine, so that the settlements take up 5% and then 10% and then 15% and then 20%. Well, that's not true. That is simply not true. But somehow or other, Israel has been unable to convey that.
Jackson Deal.
Jackson.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how this plays back into Israeli politics. We've had
2 Israeli elections in the last 22 years in which the incumbent went into the election in a state very much at odds with the U.S. administration. Both times it resulted in his defeat, and in both cases, certainly Israeli analysts were of the opinion that a major reason for the defeat was discomfort of Israelis at the fact that their prime minister was at odds with the U.S. administration. Now, we can see in this case that Netanyahu is clearly thinking that this time it's not going to work that way, because he's choosing to take on the American president just weeks before the election. And so I'm just wondering, in your analysis, when you look at Israeli opinion, does he have a sound ground to believe that this time he won't be punished by Israeli voters for being at odds with the U.S. president? And why, if he does?
Sure. Yeah. The polling that we did and other polling that's been done since the whole speech controversy has happened shows this dichotomy that I mentioned at the beginning, which is Israelis recognize that the relationship with America is really, really critical, but they think that Obama's policies are wrong, which dilutes the effect. In other words, if we had George W. Bush saying, I don't want you to make a speech to Congress, or Bill Clinton saying, I don't want you to make a speech to Congress, that would bing for the Israeli, be a big bing in the head of the Israeli voter, wow, Or if Senator Joe Lieberman and John McCain got up tomorrow and said, Mr. Prime Minister, this isn't the right way to do it, bing, that would recognize. But so long as it's the fact that Israelis see that Obama's policies are wrong, they tend to think, there's a narrow majority who think that Netanyahu shouldn't make the speech. There's a narrow majority of people who say if they change their vote, they change it against Netanyahu. It's about a 7%, which means that in political terms, it registers if it's a boxing match, Herzog can land a few punches, but it's a long way from a knockout blow. The interesting thing I got from straw polling friends of mine who are swing voters, who voted Barak or Yesh Atid in the past, and they said to me, well, I think we're going to vote Netanyahu this time, which surprised me. And I said, why? And they said, well, because in the last war, he was a safe pair of hands. He didn't listen to Bennett. He didn't try and go all the way in Gaza. And which is not something that you see in the polls. But what it is that the people who were annoyed with Netanyahu, the people whose standing has fallen on foreign policy are the right. The centrists thought, you know what? He was okay. He stood firm. He didn't give in this way. He didn't give in that way. We don't love him, but he's a safe pair of hands. And so they would tend to think maybe he is got this question wrong with America, but they'd say he's still the safest pair of hands out there. And unless it's a real headline that is not the case, that the whole relationship with the US is up for grabs, not just the relationship with Obama, unless that is made abundantly clear, it won't punch through the consciousness of that part of the public that moves around, of which in this election is very, very small. The blocs, there's been very few voters that have swung between blocs, center, left, Arab, right. It's moving within the blocs. It's hard to see how this crisis between the administration and the government will change that unless it's perceived to be something much bigger. And at the moment, it just isn't.
I agree with that. I would only add that, normally what Jackson is describing is what happens. That is, tension with Washington is a clear negative. I wonder if now, because of the many security threats that Israel faces, it isn't to some extent hurting Herzog because it makes him look weak. And Israelis need someone who looks strong. When, I think it was during the Saban Forum, which is a couple of months ago, Herzog was asked about Iran, and he said he trusted President Obama on Iran, which I think from an Israeli political point of view may have been the wrong answer, because it wasn't tough enough. So, we'll find out on March 17th. And if Herzog is prime minister, then the pattern that we saw twice will have been proved an even deeper certainty in Israeli politics.
I would just add on this, Jackson, and I should give you a full introduction. Jackson Deal is the deputy editorial editor of the Washington Post. For those of you who don't know his name, I'm sure most of you do. I think, look, on one hand, when you compare to Shamir in 92, where the issue was settlements, here, because the issue was Iran, it's viewed as more existential, and therefore I think it gives him a little stronger ground. Even though, like Johnny said, 54% of these polls that I've seen don't want him to go now. I think they would like him, many would like him to defer until after the election. But the mechanical answer, which doesn't sound so lofty, Jackson, I think personally, is that the multipolar nature of the Israeli electorate means you don't need 54% to get it's more important to consolidate your bloc. And Netanyahu is so nervous that he will be neck and neck with Herzog, and Rivlin will give the nod to Herzog because of 1 seat or 2-seated advantage. He is more focused on the right wing voter than he is on that centrist voter. He's visiting now 3 settlements in campaign schedules. I don't want to emphasize this. He doesn't visit settlements normally. Suddenly he's visiting 3 settlements. Suddenly you have, Bennett. It's kind of funny. The guy to his right saying, hey, why don't you go after those more left-wing voters? Because he sees that he's eating his lunch and that he's more focused, and Johnny kind of alluded to it, of looking within the bloc than believing that you could cross over. And I think it's true. I saw President Obama in the midterm elections. He wasn't on the campaign trail much, doing a lot of fundraising, but if people think that people can be polarizing, they tend to say, hey, he doesn't have a lot of crossover appeal. So the net effect is to say you're a known figure after so many years at the helm. The prime minister is, the president is, and not to criticize either of them that way, but just say it's harder to get that crossover voter. And then it's easier to go after the voter within your bloc and take it away from Bennett. And therefore, the 54% isn't as critical. He has other strategies, in my view, after the elections on getting some of these other voters. I think Elliott and I both agree that a wide government with labor, I think, would be something that would be more appealing to him. But anyway, we'll have to see. But I just think as Americans, it's completely counterintuitive to Americans because the American approach is in a general election, you converge on the center. That's America. But I think in this election, where you have so many parties, the focus is within the bloc, especially given the length of Netanyahu's tenure, which makes it harder to cross over. That's anyway.
A very quick addition. I have a brief article in the Weekly Standard this week saying, everybody knows that this election is a referendum on Bibi Netanyahu. Wrong. After 10 years, everybody knows what they think of Netanyahu. This is a referendum, in my view, on Bougie Herzog. The question for the people who don't love Netanyahu is, can we trust this guy to be prime minister? So I think that's the referendum, really.
If I were to do a book like yours, Johnny, on what the attitudes are in Congress with regard to Democrats and Republicans, at the current time, based on 45 years of watching this directly, I'd have to say that 95% of the Republicans can be considered pro-Israel and 85% of the Democrats. And to the extent that in our system of government, Congress does have a real role to play, although it is limited, of course, doesn't this counteract some of the split that you might have in the public between Democrats and Republicans?
The short answer is yes, but it's not as strong as you might, it's not as solid as you might hope. First of all, if you look at all the staffers if you look at all the people in the administration who make policy on the Middle East and where they come from, what think tanks, where they've been studying, how they think about things. At the end of the day, the administration is more important than Congress on foreign policy. And the kind of people and the way they think on the Democratic side have changed. It is not Bill and Hillary Clinton anymore. It's not that crew. It's a different crew, and they think differently. And that has nothing to do with Congress. And that is, again, there's all sorts of constraints, but their predispositions, what they would like and what they will do if they get the chance, is different. And that's very deep. That runs very deep, is what I'm trying to say. The second thing is in Congress, I did some speaking with congressional staffers, and I get the impression that, if generally speaking, there are 30 Democrats in the House who take a position that Israel would like to be otherwise, there are 60 who would like to take that position, but for a whole series of other things, don't take that position. And if, for example, it was ever part of the Republican idea that you'd separate Israeli aid from all other foreign aid was ever passed, I'm sure that 30 would increase, because I'm sure that part of the reason the 30 doesn't become 60 is because of all sorts of other interests that Democrats support foreign aid more than Republicans. They want it. It's tied in. Israel's foreign aid is tied into lots of other things. You would see it go up. It's not going to be the British Labour Party. It's not going to be the British Parliament. Don't get me wrong. But it would suddenly, a lot more air would be given to views that appear in the liberal discourse that don't appear in Congress. Those deals could change because they're a function of certain other political realities. Right now, that's all very stable. Yeah, you're right. But I'm not so sure it's like that the foundations are so deep that they're never going to move. It's also true that even in Europe, left-wing publics are more hostile to Israel than left-wing elites. Most policymakers, when you start to go up a level, once they start to know more about it, they understand the thing, they're more circumspect. They just are, because they understand the trade-offs and they don't want to get their fingers burnt, and they understand it's not simple. So that also plays in. But I wouldn't be overly
confident that Congress is just forget about it. You don't need to ever worry about it. I think that it requires patience, and it requires analysis, and that what I'm saying makes it much easier for Democrats and liberal Democrats to go along with and support Israel and aid to Israel, so long as Israel crosses the threshold of credibility on the peace process. If it crosses that threshold, then they're not going to start making a song and dance, right? When it looks like it's not crossing that threshold, things start to build.
Jacques Roman.
Thank you. Given the extreme importance Israelis have for the security relationship with the United States, and according to the latest polls, Israelis are very, very worried about the Iran deal that is being. Let's assume, only slightly speculatively, that the speech goes through, nothing changes, the president presents the Iran deal as the most realistic thing short of war, and it's a deal. How would that affect this U.S. Israeli relationship on the security issue, especially from the perception of most Israelis?
So here's a very interesting thing that I didn't get into. That was the most surprising thing of our poll was, traditionally, a majority of Israelis think that even if the United States says that Israel shouldn't attack Iran, if it comes down to it and it's an existential threat and it's Iran with a bomb or not, Israel should attack. Not this time. Not this time. A slim majority of Israelis, I can't remember, it might have been 53, 47, 40, something like that, very tight, said no. If the US says to Israel, don't attack, you don't attack. It's very close, right? It's a division. It's only but in the past it's not been like that. It's been clear, right? It's not only to do with the US relationship, it's to do with everything that's going on. Israelis are starting to pay a lot more attention to this issue. It was a dead issue. In 2009, there was Mofaz made some very big comments about we're going to bomb Iran, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. Public shrugged its shoulders and said, we leave it to you, you're the experts, get on with it, right? We're not getting involved. Now they are getting involved, and they look at what's going on and they say, okay, what can we do? They listen to what the former head of the Mossad says about what we can do and what we can't do. Two of them, they're critical of Netanyahu's government. They listen to that. They look at the negotiations and they think, Israel attacking after there's an agreement. So they may think an agreement is bad. They do think it's bad. They think it's terrible. It's clear, right? No one thinks so, but very few people think Obama's got a good policy. The public turns out to be more sophisticated than I would have thought, in which case they say, yeah, but we have to factor in what will happen if at this particular point we break with the US. If Iran was shown to be not keeping some part of the agreement, and Israel at that point moved, there'll be a whole different ballgame, right? Because that's the thing that the Israeli public is making a quite sophisticated calculation, right? Which is surprising, I think. So I don't know how it would play out over time. In the short run, there's not going to, the politicians will make a lot of noise. The public will be calculating, which is maybe back to front, yeah? But after that, I would think that Israel as a whole would be looking to see that if there was any evidence whatsoever that the Iranians were not sticking by the thing or there was any movement and Israel thought it could do something, I think a prime minister would be able to galvanize the public. If he thought he could do something that would actually make a difference, he could galvanize the public. But he would need that.
Elliott, when you answer the question as well, can you relate to the point that Johnny said? I mean, some people say, first of all, Netanyahu is risk averse. He's risk averse on peace. He's risk averse on war. The same safe hands on Gaza means that he's going to be much more cautious. And then relate to the timetable issue, which is that if there is going to be an Israeli action, it has to be before an agreement, or else you'll be seen as the spoiler. How do you answer those?
When I ask Israelis whether they think that Prime Minister Netanyahu will strike Iran. The answer, people have firm views, yes or no, and it's all psychiatry. That is, when I ask them, well, why is that your view? Those who say no don't say, let me show you the political analysis of, no, it's sort of, Bibi, he's not going to do it. You don't know Bibi. It's that kind of shall we say, gut or informal analysis. I think that the President Obama did not, of course, a couple of summers ago, bomb Syria. And if you look at the opinion polls, something, if I remember the number, it was 78% of Americans thought he should not. I'm convinced, I have no way of proving this at all, I'm convinced that had he done it and gone on TV the next day and said, we've done it, we had to do it, planes have returned, we did it because we're not going to leave to our children the kind of world, blah, 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 you can write the speech. I think the support would have been 78%. I would say the same thing here. That is, the decision to bomb Iran is for Israel a fantastically complicated and dangerous decision. If it is made, and the Prime Minister then and the Chief of Staff and the Chief of Military Intelligence and the Defense Minister are then the next day explaining, I think support for the decision would rise. And then the question would be, what is the price to pay? There was very strong support for Olmert going into Lebanon in 2006 for about a month. And then, of course, it collapsed when the war did not go as well as most Israelis believed it would go. So, what would happen would depend on how much of the Iranian nuclear program is destroyed and what price Israel pays, and pays quickly, for doing that. So I think there are a lot of variables here. Timing, sure, it would be better and easier from the Israeli point of view to do this prior to an agreement being signed. And if there is no agreement now, in March and June, that offers Israel another window. Cheating offers another window too, although it's complicated. The history of this is an arms limitation or arms control agreement. The history of all arms control agreements, including, I might even say, starting with the U.S.-Soviet agreements, is that the people who sign them don't want to hear about cheating. They don't want to know about it because it shows that they were incompetent or stupid or taken in or foolish. They don't want to hear about it. So they deny it. Those of you who are old enough may remember the Krasnoyarsk radar array. There are a lot of examples like this. And I think the problem would be, I'm not so sure what an opportunity opens for Israel if they say, look at this cheating, and the Russians and Chinese and British, French, German, and even Americans say, what cheating? What cheating? The figures are not in. The figures are not clear, which is likely to happen, I think.
Our newest fellow, Professor Mohammed Tijani from Belfast University.
My question is to Elliott. Could you explain or elaborate what did you mean when you said that should survivors die, the Holocaust will fade? Because if you look at the Armenian massacre, there are no survivors yet. It is very alive in the lives of Armenians. It was said about the Palestinian Nakba that once the people die, the young people will forget, and I tend to find the young people are more gung-ho about the Nakba than because the significance of the Holocaust that it looms in the psyche of Jews never again, and so it is in the negotiations and it is everywhere in Israel, in this Holocaust attitude even towards Iran, and so. I didn't understand that when you said that. I see it extremely ingrained in the Jewish psychology, like the Nakba is ingrained in the Palestinian psyche. So I did not understand.
I'm not sure. It's a very good question. It sort of deserves a 3-hour discussion, but I'm not sure that's right, because I think if you look at American Jewish life from 1945 until, let's say, 67, certainly, the Holocaust was not a central matter. you could even argue that until 67, Israel wasn't such a central matter. I think things do rise and fall in importance. It's only the last few decades that the Holocaust has so greatly risen in importance. And it's striking, in a sense, it's risen here more than in Europe, which is where the Holocaust took place. So I think there is I think it is not a natural, inescapable phenomenon that the Holocaust rises to the top of the Jewish psyche and stays there. I think it has been an interesting and somewhat tortuous path. What happens when now it's kind of institutionalized. Now you have Holocaust museums, especially, of course, the one in Washington. But the question then becomes one of peoplehood. That is, okay, so those who identify very much as Jews may identify the Holocaust as a critical piece of their Jewishness. How many Americans of Jewish heritage and background will identify as Jews, will participate in Jewish peoplehood? I'm struck, we have all these opinion polls that say Jews believe this and Jews believe that. One of the questions that one has to ask is, for the purposes of that poll, who are you identifying as a Jew? That is, if you were identifying an individual who says, well, my parents were Jews, I don't believe in this religion, I don't belong to a synagogue, I have outmarried, and I'm raising my children as Christian. Why does that person count as a Jew for your opinion poll? So, and does that person really feel so strongly about the Holocaust? And will his children feel so strongly about it? I think there is more flexibility in this. The examples you give of Palestinians and Armenians are interesting in one particular way. It may be that there would be a greater and deeper feeling about the Holocaust if the world denied it, as has so often been the case, for example, with the Armenian genocide. There is a struggle to get the fact of the Armenian genocide acknowledged. That has not happened really. I mean, there are Holocaust deniers, but fundamentally it has not happened for Jews, and that may actually take some of the energy out of the fight, it would strike me.
Any other questions?
Yeah, Bill.
Yeah, Mark Sievers.
Thanks.
Also a visiting fellow from the State Department. Thank you.
I'm wondering about the effect of the perception, certainly in the States, and I believe this is the case in Europe as well, that Israel has steadily moved to the right on the loss of support certainly among liberals and the left, but maybe in the center as well. And I'm wondering, my own view is that it's actually a much more complex question. The ideological right in Israel, I believe, is much weaker today than it was 30, 40 years ago, but the imperatives of security concerns are probably much stronger, and that may continue to be the trend. Is there a basis there for engaging people on the left? I think you sort of alluded to that in a different way, Jonathan. But
I should add that Mark was the head of the political section of the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv, also more recently in Cairo as well. So I should add that.
thanks.
Yes, it's. Sorry, just remind me again. I've just slipped my mind. It's the the Israeli right. Israel's moved to the right.
Yeah.
It appears a lot in the discourse. It's said a lot. It's said a lot, and it's used strategically, I think, to present things that way, because that way you don't have to deal with the complicated security issues, the breakdown, you don't have to deal with what one of my friends who was a negotiator for Israel under the Olmert years said, well, we're closer than we've ever been before with the Palestinians, but it's like two magnets that won't touch. You don't have to deal with the fact, with why they won't touch, right? If it's all that Israel's moved to the right. So I think it's deployed strategically, and it resonates because although the Israeli public is exactly as you said, much less ideological, the fact that there's there's deep cynicism about the possible of a negotiated solution has empowered voices on the ideological right. They don't really represent, but they're empowered. And so you hear them a lot more, so that argument has credibility. Certainly, therefore, what Elliott says about the Israeli center and left engaging, their European, it's true. But it's not only that. I looked at the question, there was some polling done when Olmert was prime minister, and he was in the middle of serious negotiations about who do Americans think the U.S. should put most pressure on. And liberals said Israel and conservatives said the Palestinians. In other words, there are constructive things that one can do, but even if one does those constructive things, one has to understand that this doesn't originate with Israel. We play into it. We're played into and we're used, and some of it is true, but the core of it is changes in America. That's the foundation, and that's what makes it such a serious challenge. And that's why, in Israel, the left would simply say, well, change the policy. Well, changing the policy will help, right? And the right would say it doesn't make any difference. Well, no, it does make some difference, but they also got a point. It's also not just simply to do with what we do. And that's why it requires a kind of focused response with realistic kind of expectation of what can be moved and how much it can be moved.
I would just add one point, which is even if you agree Israel has moved to the right, then you have to define right. Now go back to the year 2000. What unites the Israeli right? Well, the most obvious thing is opposition to a Palestinian state, which had, of course, once been the American position, but certainly the right, Ariel Sharon and so forth. And all of a sudden, around 2000, the Israeli right, including now Prime Minister Netanyahu, accepts a Palestinian state. So it's funny to say that Israel has moved to the right when the right is accepting positions that used to be held by the left.
Right. Final question, anyone? Okay, looks like we solved it all. So I want to thank our two panelists for a really stimulating session. I know I gained a lot from it. I hope you did too. And thank you all again for coming, and stay warm this afternoon. Thank you all.